I'm going to be talking about this Act on Climate bill that is recently introduced and currently pending in the General Assembly. Can you hear me in the back? Please say something if you can. I'll do my best. We now have bill numbers, as you see on those handouts that you got on both sides of the General Assembly. On the House side, the bill number is H7399. On the Senate side, the bill popped up just today. The bill number is S2165. I'm actually going to hold on to this.
Okay, I'm just looking for the pile so I can
The
hand it out.
pile is gone.
The pile's gone.
The pile is gone.
All right.
I'm going to start with just a word of context so we see where this bill fits in. In 2014, Rhode Island enacted the Resilient Rhode Island Act. As it was originally written by Ken Payne, who is here tonight, and others, the Resilient Rhode Island Act would have put into place mandatory carbon emission reductions for the entire state of Rhode Island. In their infinite wisdom, when the General Assembly actually passed and enacted that bill, they tweaked it just an eensy-weensy little bit and made those mandatory carbon emission reductions purely optional, aspirational, precatory. The bill is unenforceable. This bill, which we're technically calling the Resilient Rhode Island Act of 2020, therefore updates the bill from the now statute from 2014. And it does so in two important ways. First, it makes the carbon emission reductions in the bill more stringent, more in keeping with current science. The reduction for 2035 shifts from 45% below 1990 levels to 50%. The aim for 2050 is not 80% reduction, but net zero carbon emissions, no carbon emissions from the state by 2050. That's the first change. The second change, as you may gather, is that it changes those purely aspirational, precatory, unenforceable goals into mandatory, required carbon emission reductions. Let me say three things about the bill and what it does. First of the three is that the carbon emission reductions provided for in the bill are economy-wide. It's the entire state. In Rhode Island, we have a reasonably good suite of renewable energy laws, but electricity and energy is only one sector that contributes to carbon emissions and climate change. Here in Rhode Island, like the rest of New England, the transportation sector is both the largest contributor to carbon emissions and the fastest growing. And largest size and fastest growing is a pernicious combination. The second thing about the bill is that it is mandatory. It is not aspirational. These are mandates, not goals. And the third, which goes with mandatory, is that it is enforceable by private lawsuit. And let me give you an example. In 2008, Massachusetts enacted the Global Warming Solutions Act, which provided for mandatory carbon emission reductions in the state. I'm pleased to say that the bill was written by a then CLF colleague of mine, Sue Reed. Unfortunately, Massachusetts wasn't doing what was required under the bill. So we, Conservation Law Foundation, sued the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for not following the required mandates of the bill. We lost the case in Superior Court. We took it to the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, and we won. This bill in Rhode Island provides a private right of action to sue the state if it doesn't follow the requirements and mandates of the bill. That means that any person, you or you or you or you, could sue to enforce the provisions of the law when it becomes law, or entities like Climate Action Rhode Island or CLF could do that. So the three salient aspects of the bill are that it's economy-wide, it's mandatory, not aspirational, and it is enforceable. I'd like to add a word about what I see as some advantages of the bill. I'll also talk about some predictable opposition to the bill so that when you come back here on Wednesday of next week and you do your advocacy training, you can think and work on appropriate, effective responses to predictable opposition. But first, a couple of things that I like about the bill. The bill is very, very short and direct. I lobbied last year in the General Assembly in support of a Global Warming Solutions Act that was modeled on the Massachusetts model. The bill was so long and so complicated that our explanation sheet about what the bill did went on for reams and reams of paper, and when we tried to describe the bill to the members of the General Assembly, their eyes glazed over. This bill is really short and direct, and the way you can tell that is that the handout I gave you tonight about the bill is one page, one side, and it explains everything about it. It's economy-wide, it's mandatory, it's enforceable, and it updates to 2014 Resilient Rhode Island Act. That's it. It's simple, it's easy to explain, it's not complicated. I think that's a big, big advantage. Second, I think that by updating a law that the General Assembly enacted in 2014, we have an argument with the General Assembly. We say, look, you guys passed a good law in 2014. We're making it better. We're making it enforceable. We're bringing the carbon emission reduction up to date with the current science. But we're building on what you did. Let's make it better. So I think that's also an advantage. Opposition. Opposition is predictable. Let's start with the American Petroleum Institute. And their very, very smart, very, very effective lobbyist, Lynette Forer, formerly Lynette Boiselle, nay Lynette Forer. When Lynette testified in the General Assembly last year against the Global Warming Solutions Act, here's what she said. She said to the members of the General Assembly, do you guys have any idea how thoroughgoing the changes to our economy and our society would be if this bill passes into law? And I'm here to tell you that Lynette from the American Petroleum Institute was right. I hope that that's not the headline on ecoRI tomorrow. CLF says the American Petroleum Institute was right, but that's what I'm saying. And I think the answer to that is, that's right. The change is deep and thoroughgoing because climate is an emergency and that's what we need. Lynette is not wrong, she's right. There is other predictable criticism of the bill. The bill doesn't go far enough. There are groups in Rhode Island that won't support the bill because there is no green jobs or Green New Deal component to it. That is true. I think the bill is a very, very good one because it's clean and short and effective and provides for huge carbon emissions in a mandatory way. But it is true that there are things that are not included in the bill. The bill does not provide for a worldwide global carbon budget. because the world we live in is one in which many countries, including, among others, China, India, and the United States, continue to increase carbon emissions. And we have here in Pawtucket very little control over what Narendra Modi's government does in New Delhi. We're living in a country with a Trump administration that is doing their best to roll back the very, very, very modest environmental policies of the Obama administration. And in a context where the world and the country are not doing enough, this is a very, very effective thing that we can do. There are now, sitting here today, I'm standing, but you're sitting. Sitting here today, there are exactly 3 states in the country that have mandatory, enforceable carbon emission reductions on the books. 2 of them are neighboring states of Massachusetts and Connecticut. The 3rd is California. If this bill passes, we will be the 4th state in the country to have mandatory, enforceable, binding, steep carbon emission reductions going down to net zero in 2050. And if people tell you that there are things that this bill doesn't do, they're right. There are things that this bill doesn't do. This is merely a very, very, very strong, very, very effective, very, very desirable climate bill, which would put Rhode Island at the front of the entire country if it were enacted. It will be a very, very, very big lift. Come back next Wednesday to learn about effective advocacy techniques. It'll be a very, very big lift. But if people say to you that there are things that the bill doesn't do, it's true. Questions? Sir?
I have several questions. One is a matter of clarification. In your point, the first point, you say 100% reduction. And I've noticed that you keep going back and forth between 100% reduction and net zero reduction.
Yes.
And those 2 things are very, 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 very different. Because net zero reduction, which is in the bill, unless it hasn't changed, opens the door for carbon trading.
So let me answer your question, which it is. The bill is available on the General Assembly website. Peter is correct that there is a difference between zero emissions and net zero. The bill says net zero, and there's a reason for that. And that is that there are some industries like steel production. There are some questions like embedded emissions on imported goods that are very difficult to address, and that by making this net zero rather than absolute zero, we take away an important objection to the bill, which is that it's Pollyanna-ish and unattainable. Peter points out that by opening the door to offsets, it is possible to have mischief, and Peter is correct about that. It is possible to have mischief. Net zero emissions is by far the best that we could do in a bill like this. It is not perfect. It puts us on a track to zero emissions by 2050. And how those offsets will be arranged by rule will be a very, very, very important sequela to enacting this bill. You had another question?
Yeah, well, actually, I have several questions. But
Let's take a couple and then we'll move on to
Yeah,
other
we should
people.
spread out the questions.
Okay,
We'll
let
take
me ask
another
one
and then
more.
we'll spread them out.
Okay, let me ask one more question. So 100% you've answered. Now let's talk about 50%. And in my book, 50%, although it sounds well-defined, is undefined. Why is it undefined? because there are several kinds of emissions. There are carbon dioxide emissions, there are methane emissions, and there are 4 others that are in the Kyoto Protocol. Forget about the 4 other ones. Take just the methane and the carbon dioxide. In order to accomplish 50%, you have to have a way to add different emissions up. People use the global warming potential to
Is
do
there a
that.
question, Peter?
The question is, what do you mean by 50%? Do you mean that the addition is by the global warming potential that on the 100-year scale?
I understand the question. I understand
Well,
the
I wonder
question.
whether people in the audience understand the question. That's why I was a little lengthy.
Every state, which is now 3 states, that have enacted mandatory binding carbon emission reductions use the same standard, which is CO2 equivalent, which accounts for the different potency of different greenhouse gases, such as CO2 and methane.
Which time scale?
Those are matters that will be decided by rule after the statute is enacted. And if you say that those are important questions to be addressed, I will agree with you enthusiastically and wholeheartedly, and that's why groups like CARI and CLF will be there working to ensure that the rulemaking is proper and honest.
New York addresses this, you know.
Sir.
When is this coming for a vote, and is it likely to pass?
Excellent questions. Let me take your last question first, but I'll come back to your second question. Is it likely to pass? I don't know, I'm not clairvoyant. I believe that passage this year is by no means a sure thing. It'll be a very, very, very difficult, heavy lift, and it'll take everybody in this room and everybody you know. However, I believe that there are several reasons for optimism. One is I have discerned in the State House this year significantly more and more genuine interest on the part of legislators to enact a real climate bill this year. If you go on the General Assembly website and you look up these bills and you look at, they list 5 of the lead sponsors, this year for the first time we have significant participation among the sponsors and among the lead sponsors from House and Senate leadership. That is a good augury for passage of a bill. I think, yes, Mattiello is a serious, serious problem.
That's not what I said, but that's okay.
Okay. Absolutely. I think that the discernible change in the mood in the State House is in part due to the recent advent of real grassroots support for climate action, and I'm thinking now particularly about the Sunrise Kids, who've had multiple demonstrations at the State House. I've observed them, I haven't participated, and that has brought a really new and different mood to climate advocacy. It may not pass, it will be a difficult lift, but there is reason for cautious optimism. Now, when will it be heard and how will this work? Very, very good question. There I will give you a second handout.
You might need to share.
Share, remember? So, the Senate side and the House side will both hold hearings in the Environment Committee on this bill to decide what to do. By law, we need to have, the hearings have to be posted on the General Assembly website, on the Secretary of State website, 48 hours in advance. But we are working with the sponsors to see if we can't get a week or two of advance notice. Anybody and everybody who wants to testify about the bills can come to those hearings and testify, including everybody in this room. I am passing out, Priscilla explained that she was the president of the Environment Council of Rhode Island, the coalition of all 62 small, medium, and large environmental groups in the state. These are guidelines from ecoRI about how to comport yourself when you're up there lobbying for maximum effectiveness. They're not mandatory, these are not obligatory. These are ecoRI suggestions about what to do. Bring them with you to your advocacy training session here next week and discuss with your trainers what they think about these guidelines. ecoRI has developed them over a period of many, many years based on what we see in the State House. So sometime later this winter or spring, I am guessing March or April, that's a guess, the Senate Environment Committee, the House Environment Committee will hear these bills. You guys have a lot to do before those hearings, working with your own legislators to get their support for this bill. And then we want a lot of people up there testifying in favor of the bill.
Can I just do one follow-up question? I know that
Peter got one, you should get one.
most colleges and universities also have sustainability and resilience initiatives on their campuses. And Rhode Island is rich with colleges and universities. So is there some network of trying to get all the
Yes.
education institutions behind this bill?
Yes. Justin, you had a question.
Yeah, so in the past, we've tried to introduce carbon taxes as a sort of means for actually making the transition happen. Sunrise and we have endorsed the Green New Deal as a concept for, public infrastructure spending as a way of propelling the transition from dirty energy to clean energy. So how do those kinds of legislative attempts to actually, legislate how the transition happens, how do those relate to legislation that just specifies the goals without saying how we get there? Like, will we still be trying to pass a Green New Deal next year, say?
We may be. The Energize Rhode Island Coalition, which was the driving force behind the carbon pricing bill for several consecutive years, is not pushing a carbon pricing bill this year because they want to get behind this bill and see a very broad, very united front supporting this bill. I don't know what the Sunrise folks will do who are supporting the Green New Deal. This lacks that sort of provision, so they may abstain from this. I believe that these are different, potentially parallel efforts to the same goal. I think that the work that the Energize Coalition did on the carbon pricing was actually very, very thoughtful, very, very well done. It was unsuccessful. We're making another run at climate. If you woke me up at 3 a.m. when my speech sensor is depressed and you asked me the question, I would probably say that this bill may have some benefits or advantages over the carbon pricing, but I'm not unaware of the fact that every economist in the country thinks that carbon pricing is the best way to go. These are different approaches. I think this is the one that the broader environmental movement in Rhode Island is uniting behind. There was a meeting of the Environment Council on Monday of this week, and it was very clear that ecoRI, the coalition of all 62 small, medium, and large environmental groups in the state, is getting very, very, very strongly behind this bill. There was medium amount of discussion, including acknowledgement of criticisms of this bill, including that it doesn't go far enough, and there was very uniform and very strong support for this bill. I think that augurs well for it as well. I would not be heard to criticize other approaches like the Green New Deal, which CLF has endorsed, like carbon pricing, which we supported strongly. These are companion efforts. If this bill passes, which will be a heavy lift, Rhode Island would be the 4th state in the country to have mandatory, sharp, enforceable carbon emission reduction requirements written into law. I hope that's responsive. Yes?
You spoke about enforcement. One of the concerns that I have about enforcement is that there's a financial component to enforcement. And if this passes environment on both sides, then isn't it going to get kicked to finance for enforcement?
No. So you're raising two different questions, and I'll address both of them. The second question is the easier one, because there's a cost associated with enforcement. Won't this get kicked to the Finance Committee in the General Assembly, House and Senate Finance Committee? The answer is no. Almost no bills go duplicatively to two different committees. This is going to the Environment Committee on both sides. It will not get kicked to the Finance Committee. If it advances, it'll go from these committees to the floors of the respective chambers. That's the easier part. There is another aspect to your question, which is, isn't enforcement expensive? Bringing lawsuits is expensive. And the answer to that is yes, that is correct. And for that reason, you personally, individually, in 2024, when this has been law for 4 years, but the state is not doing enough, you personally may not want to hire a lawyer for $150,000 to bring a civil action in Superior Court to enforce this. You may look to an organization to do that. And the analogy here is very, very clear. When Congress passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, Congress recognized correctly that governmental agencies like our Department of Environmental Management, the Environmental Protection Agency, couldn't do all the work for enforcement because those agencies are underfunded and they can't do everything. So Congress did something very smart. They put a citizen suit provision in those statutes that said anybody can bring an enforcement action. There is not, and that's one of the things that we do in CLF, is we bring lawsuits under the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act to make sure that there's actual enforcement of those. There's a lawyer in Oregon who enforces, the solo practitioner enforces the Clean Water Act by taking his kayak up and down rivers, looking for violators and suing them. Congress put into the law an attorney fee provision so that a substantially prevailing plaintiff, you bring a lawsuit, you win, the bad guy, the defendant, has to pay your lawyer's fees. That is a significant source of funding for environmental groups like Conservation Law Foundation. We bring enforcement actions, we get paid by the bad guys. So when your friend says that enforcement is difficult and expensive, she's right. But it can be done, and it has worked very successfully for decades with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and the Civil Rights Act too, by the way, which has a private right of action and an attorney fee provision. That's what Congress does when they want to encourage meritorious lawsuits. Justin, do you want me to take more questions, or do you want
Let's
to?
have about two more. Well, it seems like there are quite a few.
Yes.
Just try and keep it moving.
Stop me when you want to. Yes.
So
I have two questions, which are, so when the bill goes to committee, and the people who are on that committee, legislators on that committee, are not legislators that represent our own district, and Mattiello, who has the final gatekeeping, is not, I don't have any weight with him because I'm not in his district. How can we, as citizens, put pressure on people who are in that committee to move it forward, and then on Mattiello to actually let it go?
People in that committee by attending and testifying, Mattiello by seeking appointments with him in his role as speaker, even though you're not in his district. Yes, sir.
The bill refers to, but it doesn't change the 2020 standard, nor does it add a particularized definition to greenhouse gas emission. Is that going to present an enforcement challenge? I mean, I could imagine going to court now with claims around the definition, the baseline of what 1990 means, and says, you haven't met it.
Yes. Good question. I think the answer to your question is no, I don't think that presents a challenge. You're right, there is nothing in here about 2020. If this gets signed into law in June, we will be looking at the next target, and it'll put the state on a trajectory of doing some rulemaking in order to ensure that this happens. Having looked around the other states that have mandatory carbon emission policies and laws, enactment of such a statute causes a flurry of activity in response to it. It will not be smooth sailing, but some of those definitional questions that you were talking about and that Peter was talking about, they're valid questions, they will be settled in the rulemaking, and all of us will be a part of that.
But it does retain 2020.
It does.
By adding it into the mandate language.
It does. Yes.
So the lobbyist from American Petroleum gets
Lynette.
out there, Lynette, she sounds great. She says, she goes, well, you're gonna have to overhaul your whole economy. And the legislators hate that and they're scared and frightened. Can you help me understand, so how does this bill, or how do we, either of those things, counteract that?
Here's one way to counteract it. I think there's a growing awareness up at the State House that the state's suite of renewable energy statutes has been the single largest driver of job creation in the state since the beginning of the recession in the autumn of 2008. That fact is what led then Senate President Pivot to go behind the backs of every environmental group in the state and introduce 3 years ago a huge new suite of renewable energy laws, all on her own, because she was simply motivated by the economic benefits to the state. I think that the one way, and you should raise this next week, but the predictable reluctance of legislators to make thoroughgoing changes to the entire economy, you raise a very, very good question. That's next week's presentation. Other questions? Yes.
I wonder whether we're shooting too low. I get the sense that we're creating legislation that's the best we can do, and we're right on the edge of can we get it done or not. But I'm dealing with countries that have the same aspiration of carbon-free by 2030 because they're going to drown otherwise. And I wonder whether this is a kind of strategy. We get the best we can now, and as soon as we get it, we come back and say, oh, 2050 is too long away, and now we justify going for something, more rapid, or whether we simply put it on the table. Rhode Island is going to be one of the most severely affected states in the country, and therefore it's not good enough for us to do what everybody else is doing.
So to answer your question, are we aiming too low? You are not the only one who has that concern. Others do as well. I think that this is a very strong, very desirable bill. And if this is signed into law by the end of the General Assembly in June 30th, we should all in this room be very, very, very pleased with our efforts. It will not end our efforts because it doesn't address everything. It will not end our efforts, but that will have been a very, very successful General Assembly session.
Okay,
Thank you very much, Justin.